Hello, welcome back to my Knowing Dog studio and my lockdown classroom. This week's lesson is going to be on metaphor, and that subject is kind of a pet peeve for me. But before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that, as always, everything we're doing in this class is that we're learning to use the elements and principles of art as a visual language to find our own voice. And that language, part of language, is something called metaphor. And now, as I said, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, something that kind of irritates me, because whenever I bring up the subject of metaphor to my new students, and I ask them, who can tell me what a metaphor is? Inevitably, somebody's going to raise their hand. In fact, a lot of people will, because they've all had their English classes. And 9 times out of 10, the person that I call to is going to say, a metaphor, the definition of a metaphor is a comparison without using like or as. And that drives me crazy, because that's not really the definition of a metaphor. That's a literary distinction between a metaphor and a simile, okay? When you don't use like or as, it's a metaphor. And when you use like or as, that's considered a simile. For example, I'm sure that your English teachers have already given you the example of a simile with like or as something. It could be, let's say, for example, somebody who had maybe one day, been out in the country and seen a big ox pulling a plow and plowing a field and could see just, gosh, it takes so much strength to do something like that, to pull that plow and dig up the earth and all that. And then later on, he sees some gigantic man with humongous muscles, and he's doing this amazing work and lifting all these things, and he might say that guy is as strong as an ox. Okay, that's a simile using as or like. That guy is like an ox, the way he's showing his strength and moving all of that stuff around. So using like or as, that would be a simile. An example of a metaphor from a literary point of view, the distinction between a metaphor and a simile is if, let's say, said something to somebody and you said something that was, maybe he interpreted as a little critical or a little bit of an insult or something. Maybe you said something about what his favorite sporting team, and they had just lost a game that week, and you said something like, hey, how'd your team do this week, knowing that they had lost, and all of a sudden he just got really mad and angry at you and yelling and screaming, and you might say, oh my gosh, he really has a short fuse. Well, that would be a metaphor, okay? A fuse is what you would put on, like if you had a stick of dynamite or something or other, and they'll have fuses, and usually the fuses are nice and long so that you can light the fuse and then, throw it or run away and get far enough away from it before it explodes. However, if it has a really short fuse, that means you got to, get out of there right away so you don't get blown up with it. And so, that would be like a metaphor saying somebody has a short fuse because it only takes just a little bit and they get angry and right away, as though they had a short fuse. But of course, they don't have a short fuse. But you would say they have a short fuse. And that would be a metaphor, okay? So there's those distinctions, and it's not just a literary distinction between metaphor and simile. There's also something called an analogy, and those are all sort of literary distinctions between really sort of the same thing, and they are comparisons, but there's a reason that you do those comparisons, and that's what a metaphor is all about. And a metaphor can be a very powerful device, whether it's a literary device or you're using it visually, like we do in the visual arts, using a metaphor. It can be a very powerful tool for artists to use to really communicate much more effectively with a lot more power in your voice. So there's lots of sort of similar sort of things that some metaphors. In fact, I've asked some people what are some of your favorite metaphors, and I went on social media. I went on Facebook the other day, knowing that I was going to be preparing this lesson, and I just sort of asked some of my friends, what are some of your favorite metaphors? And there's a couple of them that I'm going to go ahead and mention. But some of them I was kind of disappointed with some of my friends, because metaphors a lot of times can also a metaphor. A lot of times if it's a really popular one can become a cliche, and when it becomes a cliche, people use it so much, it really sort of loses its power, because all of a sudden it takes on the original meaning without the real power of the metaphor. So it's from a literary point of view and from a visual point of view, you'll want to avoid the cliche type metaphors, because they've really sort of lost a lot of their power, because the whole point of a metaphor is to get the person, either the reader or the listener or the viewer, to think a little bit more and to make those connections themselves. So what exactly is a metaphor then? It is indeed a comparison, but from a visual artist's point of view, those distinctions between a simile and a metaphor and an analogy, really, those aren't important for us. Those are more from a literary point of view, when you're writing or when you're speaking words. But we're working with images, and images are worth 1,000 words, so they say. We're more interested in the true meaning of a metaphor, the true function or purpose of a metaphor, and that's an intellectual process. And what that process is simply finding connections between two different things that otherwise are very different from one another, but finding a very important connection. All right? And so, like, for example, the really strong guy and the ox, and then you can say, he's as strong as an ox, or the guy that with a short temper, you can say, boy, he really has a short fuse. Making those, it's a way of saying something with it by saying something different, and from a literary point of view, or from a visual point of view, showing something, and to get your message across by showing something else. Okay, so the question is, why? Why would you do that? And as I said, a metaphor can actually be a very powerful device to really add some power to your message, to whatever it is you're trying to say. And there's an artist named Anne Hamilton. I heard an interview of her one time, and she's a textile artist, and she works a lot with fabric. And she made the... She said during an interview that she saw fabric as a metaphor for society or community. So what would she possibly mean by that? A metaphor, fabric is a metaphor. Well, fabric is made up of a bunch of different threads. Okay, in my t-shirt here, and my pants and everything, if you look closely, you can see individual threads that are woven together to make fabric, okay? So, but she's saying that fabric can be a metaphor for society. And what she's talking about, well, first of all, if I ask you, what's a society or a community? What is that? And you might just say, well, it's a group of people, okay, and that's not very exciting, So if that's all you're thinking of society, it's just a group of people coming together, makes a community or a society, and okay, what's so special about that? But when you think of fabric as a metaphor for that, well, fabric is made up of all these threads, but it's not just any threads. If you just had a bunch of thread and you threw it down on the table in front of you, that would just be a pile of thread. It doesn't become fabric and something functional and turn into something until all those individual pieces of fabric are woven together and work together to make something bigger as a whole. And that's the way society really is too. Is it really a community? Are you really part of a community if the people aren't working together and people, assuming different roles and working together to make something bigger than any individual? But she also went on to talk about that metaphor, but that even though the fabric is made up of all these different threads coming together, the individual threads are also very interesting. She says when she's looking at a piece of fabric and then noticing the individual threads and how they can be different from one another and appreciating those differences. And so we can look at society and say, yeah, all of us people are working together for a common purpose, but we're all still very different from one another, and being able to appreciate those differences. So she was using fabric as a metaphor in a way that really sort of brought about, exposed a deeper understanding of what a community really should be all about. And what our society should really be. It's all of us sort of coming together, working together, while still maintaining our individuality, and that's what makes society a very amazing thing, when you can go into your community and see everybody working together for a common cause, but all of us are still uniquely ourselves. So I thought that was a very interesting metaphor that this artist Ann Hamilton brought up. So that's why you do a metaphor. So one of the metaphors that when I asked my friends on Facebook, what's your favorite metaphor? As I said, some of them were kind of cliches, and I was a little bit disappointed by some of them. I mean, that you hear a lot. All the world is a stage, and that's a nice one, but I mean it's overused and it's become a cliche, and so consequently lost some of its effectiveness. But another favorite one that someone used that is not really so much of a cliche and still I think I enjoyed and you can appreciate is life is a box of chocolates. If you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, he talks about how his mother used to tell him, life is a box of chocolates, and that's a metaphor. And then she goes on to explain the metaphor. She says, life is a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get. And so that final part of it sort of explains the metaphor, why life is like a box of chocolates, because you never know what you get. So when you first hear that, life is like a box of chocolates, what that means, you need to stop and think about it. Well, if you have a box of chocolates, and who doesn't like chocolate? I like chocolate. But a lot of times the box of chocolates, sometimes you might be one with a cherry covered carved cherry. One might have coconut, one have a nuts, and some might have some other kind of nougat in it. And you never really know with a lot of times if it's going to have a little cream filling in it or whatever it's going to have. And so it's a little bit surprises. And some of them you may not like as much as others. But others, maybe if you just really like chocolate covered cherries and you find the one that has a cherry in it, that's a pleasant surprise. And that's a really good metaphor for life, because life, you never really know what you're going to get, but most of the time it's pretty good. Occasionally you have some surprises, and maybe sometimes you're disappointed, but it's still a box of chocolates. And so that's another good metaphor. Life is a box of chocolates is a nice metaphor that I like. But we human beings, we like to think we're special and different from the other animals in the animal kingdom, and we like to think that we're superior to all the others, and we try to think of ways that we're different, and it used to be that we people would say, well, we have language, we can communicate, but I mean, we've discovered that actually other animals do have their own forms of language and communications, dolphins and we've even taught apes how to do sign language, and so that wasn't it, and so we also thought for a long time that what really makes us different is our ability to make and use tools, and we thought we were the only creatures that could do that. But then eventually, I think it was Jane Goodall who went out and lived with the chimpanzees in Tanzania for many years to study them. She was very interested in studying the chimpanzees, and she discovered that actually chimpanzees do make tools. I think the tools that she discovered them making were, I think what they would do is they would take a stick that had, would have leaves on it from a branch from a tree, and what they would do to make their tool, they would rip off all the leaves so that it became just a stick, and then they could take that stick and stick it down into an anthill, and the anthills or the ants would grab a hold, would get on the stick, and they would pull the stick out, and then it would be covered with all kinds of little bugs and things that they could pick off and eat. So in other words, they made like an eating utensil, like a fork or something that we would use for our plate, except they would do that. And so they made a tool, and they used it themselves. So that doesn't really distinguish us from the animals, but clearly we are, in terms of our intellect anyway. We're a lot smarter. So and I think that, you know, our ability to make these connections in such a way, to use them as metaphors in a way that sort of helps us bring about a deeper understanding of something. I think that is something that really is sort of unique to the human race, to us people. I don't know of any other instances where any other creature other than us humans have used metaphor in such a way to help us come to a deeper understanding of our world and our lives. And even as a small child, before I had ever even heard the word metaphor, I think I was able to grasp the concept of metaphor, and was able to sort of see something visually very different from something else, and make that intellectual connection and understanding to help bring me about to a deeper understanding. There's one of my earliest memories is a really good example of that. And, you know, long before I'm sure anybody had ever used the word metaphor in front of me, because I was just a small child. And it began when I was very, very young. One of my very earliest memories, I think I was maybe 4 years old. And I remember jumping up and down on the bed in my parents' bedroom, and, you know, using it like a trampoline. And I sort of fell over the edge of the bed, actually, with my head going down, and my head sort of hit the floor. And when it hit the floor, I was actually looking underneath the bed. And it was about this time of the year, you know, mid-December, as we were anticipating Christmas. And when I looked down there, I saw a box with some boxing gloves in there. And now my father was a boxer, actually, when I was before I was born, and I think right up until about the time I was born, he did quite a bit of boxing, and he was very into sports. And we would, in fact, every Friday evening, at that time, there was something called Friday Night at the Fights. And that was sort of a ritual that we had. Every Friday night, he and I would sort of sit on the sofa, and we had a little black and white TV, and we would watch the fights and with one another. And so, but as it turned out, I sort of, in fact, at the time, I probably still believed in Santa Claus, so it was probably a little bit confusing to me when a few days later on Christmas morning, when I opened up a box, and there were those boxing gloves that I had seen under his bed, and I was probably kind of wondering what the heck, you know, did Santa Claus drop them off early or something? You know, might have been a little confusing to me. But anyway, but he would almost always, whenever there was an occasion to give a gift, it was almost always sports related, because that really sort of defined our relationship to one another. It was about sports. I remember on one occasion getting a gift of a football, and usually right after he would give me the gift, you know, we would play catch with the football, and he was always, you know, giving me little boxing lessons. I thought I was, you know, quite a good boxer when I was a little kid, and he was always giving me those. And another very distinct, in fact, I can almost hear his voice now saying this to me, when he was teaching me how to dribble a basketball. You know, a basketball, you should sort of like, you know, use your fingertips, and when you're dribbling it, and even when you're shooting, you should try to keep the ball more on your fingertips. But I can remember him. I must have been sort of like you know, trying to bounce the basketball with the palm of my hand instead of off my fingertips, and I distinctly remember his words. He would say, "Dribble it, don't slap it. Dribble it, don't slap it." And that's a very distinct memory of my father when I was 4 or 5 years old. You know, trying to teach me how to dribble a basketball. But we had this very, our relationship sort of, we communicated with each other through sports, and that was a very strong father-son connection that we had when I was at a very young age. Unfortunately, when I first started school, just started first grade, my parents got a divorce. Okay, and that changed things. I'm sure that some of you, your parents have divorced, and you've had to deal with it, and it can be a tough thing to deal with, and you really need to come to terms with that. And I remember, I understood that they were getting divorced and they were no longer going to be married, and my father was no longer going to be living with us. I guess I understood all of that. But I remember, he would come to visit on weekends, but not every weekend. And I remember a lot of Saturdays, I would be hoping that he would be coming to visit, and maybe he had told my mother that he might stop by, and so if he said that he might be coming by, I was just sort of sitting there waiting the whole time, and then when he wouldn't come, I would be kind of disappointed. But I knew that very first Christmas, I knew he was going to come at Christmas time and bring some Christmas gifts for me and my sister, and he did. He came. And when he came, for me, he had a package wrapped up that was a long, skinny package like this, And I was sure that it had to be a baseball bat. And I knew that I was going to open that box up, and I was going to pull out a Louisville Slugger, and we were going to go outside, and he was going to teach me how to keep my eye on the ball and swing a baseball bat. And by the end of the day, I would be smacking home runs out of the park, And so I was sure that's what was going to happen. And so when it was time to open up my present, I opened it up and pulled out a rifle. It was a little plastic toy rifle. And I was really disappointed. I didn't want a rifle. A rifle is not something that I wanted. It wasn't. I hadn't been. I didn't make a list to Santa saying, what do you want for Christmas this year? I want a rifle. No, it wasn't anything that really interested me that much. And, but the worst part about it is, he didn't even stay very long to play with me or anything. He was off and gone, and I didn't have a baseball bat. I had this rifle. So I thought, well, I guess I'll go out and play with this rifle. And, I used to watch TV and movies and stuff like that. And the guys with the rifle, when they would, were fighting and, in hand-to-hand combat, and sometimes they would take the butt of the rifle and use that as a weapon and smack the bad guy in the head with the butt of the rifle or something like that. So I was out, playing like I was in some sort of, combat mode, and the bad guy was there, and I took the butt of the rifle and I swung it around. And this was Christmas time, and I lived in Indianapolis at the time, so it was winter and very cold, and so the plastic of that gun, it was very cold and very brittle. And when I swung it around, it hit the brick wall of the apartment complex that I lived in with my mother and my sister at the time, and it was so cold outside that plastic was so brittle, it just broke into a zillion pieces. The whole back end of the gun just shattered. The plastic and all the little pieces of plastic were just lying on the sidewalk right there. Now, that rifle was not something that I really cared that much about. I didn't really appreciate that gift, and that rifle was by no means dear to me. I really didn't care that much about the rifle. But as I looked down on the concrete and I saw all those little pieces of plastic, and I could tell, well, there's no way that can be fixed. There's no way you can put all that stuff back together. It was pretty obvious that it was just, completely gone. But it was just that rifle. I didn't care about that rifle. Except, for some reason, I just started crying. So why was I so upset, and why was I crying? Well, even though I was very young at the time, I think I was just 6 or 7 years old, and I'm sure that nobody had ever even used the word metaphor for me, and I wasn't familiar with that word. Even as a small child, my mind was able to take that process, use that process, and take these very different things and find a connection. And the connection that I saw in all those little shattered pieces of plastic was the relationship between me and my father. It was broken, and there was no way that it was going to be what it used to be. And that's why I was so upset and crying. It had finally dawned upon me what my parents' divorce really meant, and how the relationship that I once had with my father was gone, and it was never really going to be the same. And that was really when I first came to terms with that. Now that's kind of a sad story, but it shows how a metaphor can really bring you to a deeper understanding of something, and it was really important for me at that stage in my life to really understand and come to terms with that. So that was a very powerful metaphor that I was able to be. I was sensitive to that, even though I had no idea what a metaphor was at that time. My mind was able to make those connections, and in such a way that it really brought about a deeper understanding to me. So here's what I wrap up this lesson. There was one other metaphor. There was one other metaphor that a friend of mine shared with me, and I want to recite it to you, and I want you guys to think about it. And this week in your portfolios, and when you upload your images that you do this week into your Davis Digital Portfolio, I want you to put something in the text box. And in the text box, I want you to explain what you think this metaphor means, what this metaphor might mean to you. And the metaphor that was shared with me goes like this. It's art washes away from the soul the dust of everyday life. What does that mean? Art washes away from the soul the dust of everyday life. Think about that and try to figure out what that might mean to you. And I want you to put that in a text box in this week's digital portfolio. And it'll be interesting to see what each of you how each of you might interpret that metaphor. That's all I got for you this week. And have fun and making some art. And we'll talk to you later.